Hello, my name is Bernie Samples, president of the Centerville Historical Society. I'm filling in today for Janet DeBobbin, who I believe is basking in the warm sun down in Florida somewhere. Welcome to our program. Today's guest is probably the most prolific and energetic author in the Miami Valley area, certainly, if not in the entire state of Ohio. So prolific, in fact, that last year he was awarded this Certificate of Achievement by the Ohio Association of Historical Museums. I'm referring, of course, to the official historian of the Centerville Historical Society, Mr. Hauser. Howard, as he's known by his friends, which includes almost everybody in the city of Centerville because of all of the research that he's done. Howard, it's my understanding that your initial foray into writing back in 1975 wasn't entirely of your own doing.
No, my wife and I attended a meeting of the Historical Society at the Walton House, and Martha Boyce got up and told about a project that 6 members of the society had been working on for 3 years. They had found that 100 of the homes that were shown on an 1875 map of the township were still in use. And so they had researched these houses, but they wanted to make a book out of what they had come up with and couldn't find any commercial source. So Martha asked at the meeting if there was anyone there who might write the book or knew someone that would. And my wife immediately lifted her hand and said, oh, her husband would be glad to do this, and he had done work such as this, and he was retired and didn't have anything to do. And that was the first that I knew that she'd already got tired of having me around the house. We didn't do a thing on it then for almost a year. I'd forgotten about it until I ran into Martha at the Walton House on the 4th of July in 1976. And she said, oh, you're the one who was going to write the book. She said, I never got your name and wasn't able to get in touch with you. Can I come out and see you this week? Well, she did, and she brought a stack of material. And after I had gone through it for several days, I called and told her I wasn't interested. I didn't see how anybody could make a book out of the material because they had never gotten together in the beginning to establish a pattern, and they had gone off in different directions. She asked me to still consider it, and so I looked back again, and when I did, I discovered a name, James Hillen. Now, this is not a common name, but I had a great uncle by that name. I never knew him. He died a few years before I was born, and my aunt died in Springfield, so I always assumed that they lived in Springfield. But I asked for the material from the research, everything they had on the Hillens, and I discovered that James Hillen was living at 94 North Main Street, which has been called the Beasley Building, and this was in 1860, along with Frances Hauser Hillen, who was my aunt, and James Hillen's mother, William Morris, Mrs. William Morris, and a half-brother, William Morris. There was also 6 other men. I couldn't understand why, but one of them turned out later to be another great uncle of mine. And there was also a boy of 13 who was going to school in Centerville, and that was Benjamin Edward Hauser, my grandfather. And this was what got me started. If you will, Bernie, I'd like to show you, let me show you the house first.
All right.
The Beasley house there at the top.
Okay.
That is, I just discovered a few weeks ago that the reason there were so many people there, that was the Hillen Hotel. James Hillen was operating that building as a hotel in 1860. Then I found out later that my grandfather had actually been born in Centerville. Now you can show him my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was a Methodist minister. And he was born in Germany, came to the United States when he was 5 years old and married an English lady. And they had 3 children, all of whom died in Baltimore, and they decided to leave and came west in a covered wagon, staying for a few years in Zanesville, Lancaster, Circleville, Chillicothe, and other towns, always 2 or 3 years and always having a child or two, and arrived here in Centerville in 1845 and left in 1847 for Dayton, where they finally settled down. By that time, they had 13 living children. My grandfather was born in 1846 in Centerville, and then came to live with the Hillens sometime before he was 13 years old. The family then moved, sold that house, and moved to the Aschel Wright House, which is the home that the city now owns. You might show that one.
All right, that's
Bernie.
the photograph on the bottom.
That house was next to the old John Archer Tavern, the sign of the Cross Keys. And at that time, when they first lived there, James Hillen operated that tavern, and was operating at the time that they finally tore it down and replaced it with a home and office for a doctor. But he was living next door in the Aschel Wright House. They then sold the house and moved to a frame structure across the street. That house later was moved to Weller Avenue and is still in use. And then again, they bought the Aschel Wright House and moved back in there, and I believe that James Hillen built the commercial building that's directly in front of the Aschel Wright House, because at that time, in 1880, he was operating a grocery and meat market. We have an ad in the Sense of Place, a reproduction of James Hillen's ad. People look at that building and say, oh no, that can't be a grocery, it's too small. But when I was a child, that was the general size of a grocery. Many groceries were in the living room of a house. And this particular building has 2 rooms, and one could have been the grocery, the other the meat market, and there was storage space in the basement below.
Howard, excuse me. I would like to show our audience your first book, A Sense of Place, and all of these historic houses and buildings that you've been talking about are featured in A Sense of Place. And I'd like to throw in a plug for the Historical Society here. This book and Howard's other books, which he will be discussing momentarily, are all available at the Historical Society, the Walton House Museum, and these make excellent gifts. So feel free to stop in. The Executive Director, Lynn Russell, is there most every day. The museum is open to the public on Thursdays and on Saturday afternoon. But as I mentioned, Lynn is there almost every day. The phone number, if you want to call, is 433-0123. So, Sense of Place was your first book, Howard. It's now in its second printing.
Right.
So it was very successful. How did you decide to move on and write your second book, Howard?
Well, it wasn't just that I found James Hillen's name, but there was so much interesting material. I was quite interested in John Hoel. Here was a man who had served in the Revolutionary War from Bunker Hill to Yorktown, and yet I never heard anything about him locally. I never was a historian, and as such I was interested in history, particularly Civil War history, because my grandfather and 7 great uncles served in the Civil War. But I had never read any of this local history and never heard anybody ever mention it. I was intrigued, too, with the fact that I had been driving over the main street of a city that was at one time considered equivalent to Dayton. In fact, it was considered seriously for a county seat. You know, Dayton was built on a swamp where the rivers came together, 3 rivers, and they had a lot of fever in the spring. They had a lot of floods there. And so they considered coming to the town of Woodburn in Washington Township. And it was a very thriving little town at one time with industry that they didn't even have in Dayton. And it was a larger town than Centerville. So I was intrigued by these things, and after the Sense of Place was finished, the first thing I did was to research my own family and write a history of actually 8 different families. And then I began to research John Hoel, because I had done a little bit for a sense of place to supplement the information given me, and I found so much conflict. They said mostly, the historian said he was born in Virginia and served with Virginia militia, but a couple said it was New Jersey, and the names of 6 different men were given as his father. I found definite proof that he was born in New Jersey and served with the Pennsylvania militia, and his father's name was Charles. The names that had been given were, a couple of them were actually his brothers. And so there was a number of other conflicting statements, and I'd heard that they had a letter down at the Cincinnati Historical Society, so I went down to see that letter, and that letter established that John Hull was still in Cincinnati in 1795, whereas the historians of Cincinnati said he left in 1792. He did leave for a year, but he came back there. And when I asked for the letter, they brought me a large box. This was the Cincinnati Historical Society. And they said the letter was in there, I just have to look through it. Well, when I did, I found several letters and 4 reports written by General Edmund Munger of the Ohio State Militia. And it was written just before and during the War of 1812. Actually, those reports should be in the Library of Congress. They're important war documents. But that got me started then on a book on General Munger, blacksmith to general. That is a very intriguing story too, because here was a man who had actually no war experience at all. He was a farmer and a blacksmith, and yet he was given command of 2,400 men during the War of 1812, and at one time was the only force we had in the state to repel the British and the Indians. Fortunately, they didn't come down, as they could have very well have done after they defeated General Hull at the Detroit. So I started writing this, and I'd already written about Woodburn, the city that disappeared off of Whip Road. But when I started researching for John Munger, I was asked by Harriet Nutt if I would please write a book about Aaron Nutt. And I promised to do this, but unfortunately, by the time I finished the book on Munger, my eyesight had failed, and I was told that I was legally blind, and it was true. I could no longer read or write or drive a car. And so I gave up for several years doing anything until I got some help from the Cincinnati Association for the Blind, who came up with some instruments that enabled me to read after a fashion, very slowly, but still be able to read. I can't see what I'm writing, but I've learned to print reasonably well. In fact, the secretary who has done my books out of Wright State says that she can read my manuscripts much easier than she can the ones she receives from her professors. So maybe it pays to lose your sight sometimes. But I had gotten documents from Harriet Nutt, documents that had been Aaron Nutt's, and I made copies of those documents. Incidentally, today are in the possession of the Historical Society here in Centerville. And I then wrote the book about Aaron Nutt. Following that, I did a book about the Sunderland family. Now, John Sunderland was a friend of mine, and he was a descendant of the family. I didn't have to do much research. All I had to do was tap him for the information he had about the family, and it makes a very interesting story, because this family, the Sunderland family, their real name was Spencer. And the ancestor who came here into the United States was the 4th son of the 3rd Earl of Sunderland. He took the name Sunderland when he came here. But the family are blood relatives of Winston Churchill and of Princess Diane, the present Princess of Wales, and also of George Washington. So again, we had an interesting family in the area that no one really knew anything about previously.
Okay, let's review these books once again very quickly. And remember, all of these are available at the Walton House Museum. Your first book, and possibly the most successful of the lot, was A Sense of Place. And that's a history of more than 100 historical homes in the Centerville, Washington Township area. And your second book was Wilderness Doctor, the story of Dr. John Hull. And your third book was Woodburn?
Woodburn.
That came third. And that's the story of the village that is no more, I suppose.
Right.
And it was at this point that you lost your eyesight?
No, on the Munger book.
On the Munger book. All right, that's From Blacksmith to General. Then the eyesight went, and you took a hiatus for about 3 to 4 years, you said?
Yeah, I actually, it was about 5 years between printings, but about 3 years before I started doing research again.
Okay, and subsequently then you produced the book on Aaron Nutt,
Right.
and your most recent work, The Royal Rebels.
Right.
And it's my understanding, Howard, that you're currently working on yet another book?
In the process of researching different people, I've come across a lot of little stories, not enough for a book, but together I'll have about maybe 15 or 18 short articles I think will be very interesting. The Underground Railroad, the development of the first Reaper, which was apparently stolen by McCormick from a local manufacturer, and a number of other, the Indian Mound, which incidentally Martha Boyce and I found, and an individual out at Wright State took credit for, and it was excavated by the Ohio Historical Society without any indication to the Centerville Historical Society that they were going to do it. There's been a number of items like that I thought should be recorded for posterity.
And what do you intend to call this piece, Howard?
It will be called Bits and Pieces of Early Washington Township History.
All right, that's very appropriate. And in addition to the books that you've mentioned and bits and pieces which you're currently worked on, you've written numerous newspaper articles, have you not, that have been published over the years?
Right.
All right. Howard, you tell a funny story about a relative who was visiting your home one day, and I think Edna got out one of your scrapbooks.
Well, it was another one of those little books like that one you showed my great-grandfather and grandmother in. And she was sitting looking through it, and sitting side of her was an uncle of mine. And she started laughing, and she said, "Oh, who are these horrible-looking people? These are the worst-looking people I've ever seen." And he got a funny expression on his face, and he said, "That was my mother and father." And so
did Edna put the photograph book away?
Edna's been embarrassed ever since. Incidentally, we didn't mention this, but I said that my great-grandfather was a Methodist minister, but he never got paid. He traveled around the different towns around Dayton and preached in German to German congregations. In order to make a living, he worked on leather products. He especially made fancy saddles and harness. And there's a write-up in one history that he was considered an artist in leather. These are two pieces that I have of his work. I don't know how well you can see the carvings on it. These I estimate to be about 140 years old, and as you can see, they've turned black with age. I never realized that the leather could get so dark. But this was a type of work that he did for a living.
Hold those back up just a moment, Howard. Hold those back up just a moment. There you go. Good. That's very intricate, isn't it? Do you have other pieces, or is this the only two?
Well, I've got a couple small pieces, yes.
Okay.
But they're only about half the size of this one.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Howard. Howard, a few years ago, I spent 4 years as chairman of what was called the Centerville Zoning Task Force. One of our responsibilities was to completely rewrite the zoning ordinances of the city. But prior to doing that, we developed what we called a city operating plan, and it's the foundation on which all ordinances, legal decisions, and so forth are based, taking place in the city of Centerville. And I would like to read for you one of the goal statements having to do with the Architectural Preservation District, with which you're very familiar. The city, recognizing the unique panorama of architectural history that has developed along the major crossroads of our community, intends to preserve and protect the Architectural Preservation District so that it shall serve as living testimony of Centerville's past, present, and future for the benefit of all generations. And I think that speaks well for the importance with which the city of Centerville places on its history and its heritage. And that leads up to the next point which I wanted you to discuss. If you would share with our audience the story of the house on the St. Leonard property that was to be demolished and what you single-handedly did to save it.
Well, the property on which St. Leonard's was located was originally purchased by Edward Mitchell, 160 acres. And oddly enough, that man owned a slave. He bought a slave here, and against both the laws of the Northwest Territory and of the state of Ohio. I mentioned that he had slaves only because it struck me as odd we went from slavery to a complete lack or a need for any work today by all the elderly people who are living on the St. Leonard's campus. But he died within a few years after purchasing it, and it was bought then by John Tate. And John Tate, in 1820, built the brick house that stands on the entrance to the St. Leonard Center on Clio Road. John Tate came here and located there primarily because it was near a Presbyterian church. He built the house actually even a couple of years before he acquired the property. There was a delay in the getting the deed because the Edward Mitchell's property was divided up between a number of children. And when about a year or 2 years after the center was opened, the house at that time was in very poor condition. It was filled with animal life, for one thing. There were all kind of animals living up in the attic, and there were snakes in the basement. And it was nothing to see the snake go crawling across the kitchen floor and going down the stairs to the basement. So,
and as I recall, a priest did live there at the time?
Priests were living there at that time.
Coexisting with the animals.
And never bothered, he never tried to do anything about it. So St. Elizabeth, which owns the property, or the Sisters of the Poor, decided to tear the house down. And when I heard this, I told them they wouldn't be able to do it, that the community would not allow it. This was one of the landmarks of the community. And almost immediately, and without my doing anything about it, they began calling and writing letters both to the head of the St. Leonard's Center, but also to the city manager of Centerville. And as a result of that, St. Elizabeth got in touch with me and said, since you, meaning me, would not allow them to tear down the house, I'd have to do something about keeping it going. And after giving it much thought, I went to the Catholic Church there, the community church, which is actually not part of St. Leonard's, but which leases the chapel there, and suggested that if they would get volunteer help to fix up the building, I would arrange to get a lease for 5 years, rent-free for their priests. And this was done. And it was amazing what they did. We had an estimate of $60,000 to fix up the house. But we did it for, we don't know how much it cost, because individuals gave different things. They gave all the carpeting. One person gave all the new windows. The windows were so bad that you could stick your fingers through the wood, the sash. And we had all the plumbing and all the wiring replaced. We had to do a lot of plastering. And then the painting. I went down one Saturday afternoon. There were about 20 people painting the building, and I assumed they were all from the Catholic Church. And I was standing looking, and this one man handed a brush down to me, and he said, "Don't stand around and get busy." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but I can't see, so I can't paint," because I couldn't tell where I left the brush mark and where I had to meet up with it. And I said, anyway, and I did it as a joke, I said, "I'm a Protestant." And he said, "What the? I am too. I'm a Methodist." What's that got to do with this?
That was a true ecumenical effort, wasn't it?
Yes, sir. It turned out that the priest that was living there told me that when he was working clearing out shrubbery, people driving up the street pulled in and volunteered to help him get the shrubbery out. So we got a lot of help. And the house, basically, it was a fine home. Has those real 2-foot thick walls, has very small steps to the second floor like they had in those days, but it's actually a beautiful house inside.
Thank you very much, Howard, for sharing your experiences with us, and I'm pleased that we had the opportunity to share with our viewers today your importance in this community as a historian and as an author. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today, and thank you for watching. We will see you next time. Bye.